You know, when you watch like a controlled demolition of a massive building, there's always that really terrifying visceral moment where the dust is just billowing
Right.
everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. It's just a wall of smoke.
Right. The facade is completely crumbling, windows are blowing out, and from the outside, it looks like total chaotic collapse. But if you were to look closely, like with X-ray vision or something, you'd see that the massive steel girders inside aren't actually vaporizing at all.
Right. They're just shifting.
Exactly. Violently shifting. They're locking into a new, heavily reinforced configuration just to survive the blast.
Which is, such a perfect way to look at it.
Yeah.
Because the internal structure is really just shedding its old, unsustainable skin to protect the core. We tend to view regime collapse as a building turning to ash, when usually it's just a brutal, rapid architectural redesign.
Yeah, and that is exactly what we are evaluating today. We're doing a deep dive into the success and really the long-term viability of a democratic transition in post-2026 Iran. Because right now, for you listening, you know the dust is absolutely billowing over there.
It's blinding right now.
It is. So to do this, we're digging into a massive stack of sources today. We've got comparative democratization studies, think tank white papers, macroeconomic data, and these really detailed geopolitical transition blueprints. We're trying to figure out what is actually happening beneath the rubble.
Because the surface level doesn't tell the whole story.
Not at all. I mean, let's look at the baseline data from early 2026 in these sources. The supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, died on February 28, 2026. The country is just reeling from direct military conflicts with the U.S. and Israel. There's been this agonizing 84-day internet blackout.
84 days. Just incredibly disruptive.
Insane, right? And the currency, the rial, has literally halved in value in just a few months. Food inflation has soared past 70%. So, I mean, it really does look from the outside like that collapsing building.
It does. But, I really want to stress to you listening right now, the stakes here extend way, way beyond academic political science.
Oh, for sure.
Whether Iran transitions into a stable democracy or, devolves into a protracted civil war or hardens into a highly securitized military dictatorship, that will fundamentally alter global security paradigms. I mean, it reshapes global energy markets and immediately impacts the lives of millions across the Middle East. Understanding the actual mechanics of what happens next is it's absolutely vital.
Right. And the temptation, especially, when watching the protests in the streets and seeing this macroeconomic freefall, is to just assume that a democratic revolution is the inevitable next step. Like, of course, democracy is coming. Look at the chaos.
Yeah, it's a very common assumption.
But the comparative transition literature we read points out a massive, massive strategic flaw in that assumption. And they call it the phase 2 problem.
Yeah, the phase 2 problem. It's such a brilliant framework for identifying, basically magical thinking in foreign policy. Because foreign governments and even domestic opposition groups often assume this highly linear path to regime change.
Like a clean step-by-step process.
Exactly. So phase 1 is applying massive pressure, right?
Yeah.
Military strikes, crippling economic sanctions, internal uprisings. And then they just assume that phase I will automatically trigger phase 3.
Which is
the emergence of a pro-Western stable democracy.
Okay, I have to say, reading this, it instantly reminded me of that classic South Park episode.
Oh, with the gnomes?
Yes, the underpants gnomes. They have this foolproof business plan. Phase 1, collect underpants. Phase 3, profit. And when someone asks them, wait, what's phase 2? They just stare blankly.
That is literally it. It's exactly the same logic.
Right. That is exactly how some of these geopolitical strategies read when you strip away the fancy jargon. It's literally phase 1, bomb the regime and apply maximum economic pain. Phase 3, democracy. And they completely skip over phase 2.
Because phase 2 is the hard part. It requires a logical operational mechanism. You have to explain exactly how you force the armed defenders of the regime to put down their weapons or, defect to the opposition. How do you get the men with the guns to switch sides? If you cannot articulate the mechanics of phase 2, phase 3 is just a total fantasy.
Okay, but let me push back on that a little, just using the macroeconomic data we just cited. General inflation is hitting 60%. Food inflation is at 70%. The sources talk about the old rentier social contract being completely broken.
Right. The state can't use oil wealth to buy loyalty anymore.
Exactly. So if the state can't pay them off, why wouldn't the security forces just switch sides? I mean, a soldier looking at 70% food inflation has a family to feed too, right?
It's a fair question. And if Iran relied primarily on a conscript army, that logic totally holds up. Conscripts are drafted civilians, so they have deep social ties to their local neighborhoods. Historically, they're very hesitant to fire on their own communities when the economy tanks.
Right, because they're basically pointing guns at their neighbors.
Exactly.
Fun.
But Iran's core repressive forces, specifically the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and the Basij militia, they are not conscripts. They are highly ideological volunteers.
They're the true believers of the system.
They are. But, ideology is just the foundation. The true glue holding them together is actually economics. The IRGC operates as a massive corporate conglomerate. They control vast, incredibly lucrative sectors of the Iranian economy.
Like what, specifically?
We're talking about telecommunications,
Sure.
Heavy infrastructure, energy pipelines, and perhaps most importantly, the underground black market smuggling routes that bypass international sanctions.
Oh, wow. So their personal wealth is entirely dependent on the regime remaining in power. They aren't just defending a religious ideology, they're defending their own corporate monopolies.
Exactly. Individual commanders and officers understand that their economic survival, their elevated social status, and literally their physical survival are intrinsically tied to the state. If the regime falls, they don't just lose their jobs, they lose everything.
Right.
Furthermore, they have a proven institutional track record of violently suppressing domestic dissent. And we saw it in 1999, 2009, 2019, 2022, and again in December 2025.
Yeah.
They've long since crossed the psychological threshold of using extreme force against civilians.
Yeah, so economic hardship isn't going to make an IRGC commander hand over the keys to the country. It just makes them double down to protect their assets. Which brings us back to what is actually happening inside that shifting building structure. Since the IRGC isn't defecting, they're actively reshaping the state to survive the massive power vacuum left by Ayatollah Khamenei's death. And the timeline in the sources from early 2026 shows that survival instinct so clearly.
It really does. So Khamenei dies on February 28. Immediately, this temporary leadership council is formed, which includes President Masoud Pezeshkian, and they're basically attempting to project civilian stability.
Just to keep things calm.
Right. But that arrangement barely lasts a week. By March 8, 2026, Mojtaba Khamenei, the late Supreme Leader's son, is rapidly elevated to the position of Supreme Leader. But then by April 1st, the political landscape shifts dramatically.
This is the crazy part.
Yeah. The IRGC basically forms a physical and political security cordon around the state apparatus. They systematically sideline civilian politicians, including the president, and actively block his administrative appointments.
But wait, Mojtaba Khamenei is a cleric, right? If the supreme leader is still a religious figurehead sitting at the very top of the hierarchy, isn't the system still fundamentally a theocracy? How are the sources characterizing this as a coup?
So this is what comparative political scientists in the sources call the Pakistan model.
The Pakistan model.
Right, or a state of securitized military continuity. Basically, the theocratic shell remains intact to provide symbolic religious legitimacy to the broader population. The optics remain the same.
Got it.
However, the actual locus of power, the real day-to-day decision-making regarding the economy, foreign policy, internal security, all of that shifts entirely to a centralized military security council run by the IRGC.
So the military calls the shots, and the clerics just provide the religious rubber stamp.
Exactly.
That is what a Praetorian military state looks like in practice, right? The military holds the ultimate political veto over both the civilian and the religious government.
That's it perfectly. The ideological zeal that defined the early Islamic Republic back in the 1980s is being systematically replaced by military pragmatism, institutional survival, and the control of capital. The IRGC doesn't want to micromanage religious doctrine. They just want to maintain their monopoly on force.
Yeah.
It functions as a silent coup because they didn't need to actually overthrow the supreme leader. They just enclosed him.
Wow. So if the IRGC is successfully monopolizing power from the inside and establishing this Praetorian state, it puts an immense, almost impossible burden on the opposition groups trying to dislodge them from the outside.
It really does.
And the sources gave us these modern diaspora blueprints that are aimed at engineering a transition to a democratic republic. And just to be clear to you listening, we're not endorsing any of these plans or taking political sides here. We're just impartially analyzing the mechanics of these proposals based on the text to see how they intend to pierce that new security cordon.
Right, strictly analyzing the viability. So there are two prominent diaspora plans detailed in the transition literature. The first is the Emergency Period Program.
Okay.
And this is put forward by NUFDI, the National Union for Democracy in Iran, which is an organization aligned with Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. This blueprint outlines a highly compressed transition period of 100 to 180 days.
Wow, that is fast.
very fast. In that short window, it proposes completely dissolving the IRGC, enforcing rapid secularization across the entire country, and aggressively devolving administrative power to local governments.
Okay, let's just pause on that 100 to 180-day timeline. Trying to dissolve a massive, heavily armed corporate military entity like the IRGC, completely rewrite the nation's school curriculums to be secular, and totally decentralize the government in under 6 months. Mechanically, the sources basically say that sounds like pulling out the engine of a car while simultaneously trying to replace the steering wheel right as you hit the highway.
Yeah, that analogy is pretty spot on. The critical analysis of that blueprint in the white papers highlights several severe mechanical vulnerabilities. Take the proposal to rapidly devolve power to local governments, for instance.
Right.
In a post-authoritarian vacuum, rapid decentralization runs a catastrophic risk of balkanization.
Meaning the country could just fracture apart?
Exactly, fracture along deep ethnic and regional lines. The sources point out this is a particularly acute risk in provinces with significant Azeri, Kurd, and Baloch populations. Local grievances there could rapidly escalate into armed separatist movements if central authority just evaporates overnight.
And what about the top-down secularization part? Imposing that in a matter of months seems culturally, explosive.
Highly explosive. Enforcing immediate secularization like desegregating all schools and completely overhauling the educational curriculum instantly. That might find strong support in the cosmopolitan neighborhoods of Tehran. But the critiques argue it completely ignores the reality of the Shoristans. These are the rural, conservative districts where religious identity has been deeply woven into daily life and institutional socialization for over 4 decades.
Right. So if you force secularization on the Shoristans by decree from some transitional council, you practically validate the regime's propaganda that the opposition just wants to erase Islam. You trigger a massive cultural counter-revolt from the conservative base exactly when the new state is at its most fragile.
Exactly the risk.
So that's the NUFDI plan and its critiques. What is the alternative blueprint in this stack?
So the second prominent blueprint is the 10-point plan from the NCRI, the National Council of Resistance of Iran. This is spearheaded by the MEK, the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran. Now, this is a framework that has been developed over 45 years in exile.
Okay, totally different approach.
Very different. It aims for a democratic republic and relies on a highly structured, pre-articulated provisional government that is supposedly, ready to be activated the moment the regime falls.
But that sounds like the exact opposite problem. If the first plan relies on this rapid, localized 100-day shock, this one is a rigid, decades-old institutional framework. What do the sources say are the mechanical vulnerabilities of the NCRI's 10-point plan?
The main vulnerability highlighted is the lack of internal bridging. The MEK has operated in exile for decades. Their blueprint assumes that a pre-packaged provisional government designed entirely outside the country can just be seamlessly airdropped into Tehran.
Like a plug-and-play government.
Right. And it fails to account for how this exiled leadership would mechanically integrate with the localized grassroots leaders who have actually been, bleeding in the streets during the recent protest movements. A highly rigid, pre-articulated structure often just shatters when it hits the fluid, chaotic reality of a post-collapse power struggle.
So if these modern blueprints struggle mechanically, either by being too fast and risking balkanization, or too rigid and disconnected from the grassroots, how do transitions actually succeed, historically? The historical data in these comparative studies gives us a really clear lens to view this through. Let's look at Portugal in 1974, the Carnation Revolution.
Yeah, Portugal is a fascinating case study in successful democratization. During the Carnation Revolution, there was no single charismatic leader dominating the opposition, and no single military or civilian faction had enough power to monopolize the state.
So nobody could just take over?
Right. Because of that relatively even distribution of power, competing elites faced a stalemate. They realized that neither side could completely eliminate the other without destroying the country in the process.
So how did that stalemate mechanically manifest into a democracy?
Well, the competing military officers and civilian politicians were forced to create pacts. They literally had to sit down in transitional committees and establish power-sharing agreements. That forced compromise, which was born out of pure necessity rather than, idealism, yielded a stable, consolidated democracy over time.
Which is the exact opposite mechanism of what happened in Iran in 1979 during the Islamic Revolution.
Exactly. In 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini possessed immense, almost unrivaled charismatic authority. He leveraged that personal power to systematically dismantle rival factions. There was absolutely no need for him to compromise with the liberals or the leftists who had also fought against the Shah.
Because he had all the leverage.
Right. He utilized his monopoly on popular support to eliminate them and build a new autocracy. A single faction won decisively, so power sharing just never materialized.
Okay, let's bring in one more historical parallel from the sources. South Africa in 1996, the end of apartheid. That is widely considered a highly successful transition.
It is. But South Africa succeeded due to a very specific cocktail of conditions. First, they had a highly organized internal opposition with immense domestic legitimacy, the African National Congress, or ANC.
Right.
Second, they'd sustained unified global economic pressure.
Yeah.
But the crucial mechanical difference was a regime that was ultimately willing to negotiate its own exit.
Which begs the question, why was the apartheid regime willing to negotiate, whereas the IRGC today is not?
The apartheid government reached a pain threshold where the economic isolation and internal ungovernability made the status quo more painful than conceding power. They could actually see a future for themselves in a reformed state.
They wouldn't lose everything.
Exactly. For the IRGC, as we established earlier, concession equals death. They believe that yielding power will result in the total loss of their corporate wealth and, frankly, likely their lives, given their history of violence. The pain of the status quo hasn't eclipsed their fear of the alternative.
So connecting the dots for you listening. Post-2026, Iran has almost none of those favorable historical conditions. There's no pre-negotiated pact between competing elites like in Portugal. The opposition is largely fractured in the diaspora and lacks a unified internal leadership like the ANC that can genuinely challenge the state's monopoly on force. And the ruling military apparatus is absolutely unwilling to negotiate its exit.
Right. And the frameworks in the literature for measuring a successful transition require very specific benchmarks that just seem unattainable under these current conditions.
What are those benchmarks?
Well, in the short term, meaning 1 to 2 years, a transition needs to demonstrate a verifiable reduction in political repression and a stabilization of macroeconomic indicators, like halting the free fall of the real. In the medium term, 3 to 5 years, you need to execute regular competitive elections. And long-term, 10-plus years, the goal is high institutional trust and sustained economic development.
But the statistical reality presented in the comparative data is incredibly sobering when you look at those benchmarks.
It is. The historical record is crystal clear. When deeply entrenched authoritarian regimes collapse violently, whether through external military conflict or internal armed uprisings, there's a less than 25% chance that the outcome is a consolidated democracy.
Less than 25%. Wow.
Yeah, more than 75% of the time, the resulting power vacuum simply paves the way for the rise of a new, often more militarized autocracy. The most organized faction with the most guns usually wins the vacuum. And in Iran's case, that faction is already inside the house.
It's the IRGC. So bringing this all together, the post-2026 landscape in Iran is not following a clean, linear Hollywood path from a collapsing theocracy straight into a vibrant democratic republic. The Islamic Republic is shedding its clerical skin and hardening into a highly securitized Praetorian military state controlled by the IRGC. And navigating this new reality requires completely abandoning wishful thinking. Whether you are analyzing global markets or formulating security policy or trying to support human rights, understanding the true, unvarnished mechanics of power in Iran is essential. You simply cannot prepare for the future if you're operating on a fantasy version of how regime change works.
Exactly. We have to evaluate the situation based on the forces that actually exist on the ground, not the ones we wish existed.
Absolutely. But before we go, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought from these geopolitical assessments.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
It really is. Throughout this entire deep dive, we've focused on human agency, right? Airstrikes, inflation, military coups, and transition blueprints. But buried in the data, there are these quiet mentions of acute water shortages and massively failing infrastructure. What if the ultimate catalyst that finally breaks the IRGC's grip on power isn't a political movement or a diaspora blueprint or even foreign military intervention? What if it is a total ecological collapse? I mean, you can have the most loyal, heavily armed volunteer security force in the world, and you can control all the black market wealth. But when the water runs out, the rivers dry up, and the power grid fails permanently. No amount of military coercion can force the taps to turn back on.
It's so true. Nature does not negotiate with the IRGC. A Praetorian military state can suppress a political protest, but it cannot shoot a drought.
Exactly. The steel girders of that shifting building can lock into the strongest military configuration possible, but if the ground underneath them simply turns to dust, the whole thing comes down anyway. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the consensus, and we'll see you next time.